All right, so we'll get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Emily, and I'm a senior.
I'm Isabella, and I'm also a senior.
And we'll be your host for this webinar.
We'd like to wish you all a happy Valentine's Day and welcome you to the National Biodiversity Teach-In.
So we'll now let our presenter take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Naomi Rose. I am with the Animal Welfare Institute, which is the name behind me. And I'm going to share my video now, my PowerPoint, and we'll get started. I've been with the Animal Welfare Institute for a number of years, and this particular issue um, with the welfare of captive cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises when they're in captivity is a long time campaign of mine. And I've been presenting at MBTI for a number of years. And this is the talk I always give. And so every year there's some updates and some new developments. But generally speaking, I'm going to give you a background on how captivity affects these species when they're because of their ecology and their biology. So the two species I'm going to address are the largest ones that are held in captivity amongst the whales, dolphins, and porpoises, the orcas and the belugas. There are 54 orcas that we believe, we do not know for certain, are held in 7 countries. And the reason we do not know for certain is because China and Russia are difficult countries to get information from, as you might imagine. But as of today, the numbers below the screen here are accurate as far as we know. So you can see there are not very many orcas in captivity globally. This is a species that has never done well in captivity. They are very expensive to keep, and so it's been a challenge for the industry to maintain them. However, there are hundreds of belugas that are displayed in a number of countries. It wasn't even, there's so many that it wasn't worth developing a graphic for it. There are over 100, almost 150 in China alone. There are about 30 in the United States, and then there are a number in other countries, including Russia. And in Russia, we have no idea how many belugas are held there. And I'll explain why in a bit. So these two species are the largest amongst the whales and dolphins that are held, and they suffer the most because of that size, because they are wide roaming predators in the ocean. And when we put them in a tank or a sea pen, it's never going to be big enough for them. So I'm going to start by discussing their welfare, and then I'm going to get into some of the statistics about how they are still being captured from the wild, which is often a surprise to people. They just assume it's illegal, but it is not in many countries, including the United States. It is not illegal in this country to capture whales and dolphins from the wild. However, it is heavily restricted because of our Marine Mammal Protection Act. But in other countries, it is not as well restricted or controlled, and it happens. So, what are the main differences between being in captivity and living a life out in the wild as a free-ranging animal? So the main difference, as you might imagine, is space. There are 4 principal categories of differences, which I will go through one at a time here. So the first one is space. So the small print you can ignore, but the reason I put it up there is to show you that there are peer-reviewed scientific papers that support what I'm about to tell you. Those are the references below each of these larger print facts. So orcas routinely swim many, many miles a day. They are capable, they don't do this every day, but they're capable of traveling about 140 miles for each day for 30 to 40 days without any rest at all. And the reason we know this is because there is a population in Antarctica that does this. And they do it because they're trying to get further into temperate and tropical waters to shed their skin. It's a very strange phenomenon that they have to go through. When they're in the Antarctic, their skin does not slough off. It's so cold that they tend to keep the dead skin layers over, a period of time, and they actually turn yellow, almost brown, on their white parts because they're building up what are called diatoms and other algae or pseudoalgae that build up through because they're just not shedding their skin the way we do every day. Most of the dust in your house is your skin cells. And so they go north, which from Antarctica is into warmer water. And once they're in warmer water, their skin just starts coming off in big, sloughy chunks, and they turn bright and shiny white again, and they come south. And they're not finding the food they like, and so they pretty much don't eat very much. They just swim, go up there, spend a couple days up there, sloughing their skin, and then they come back down to their home in the Antarctic. So this is how we know they can do that. These are extremely dynamic, kinetic animals, and they travel great distances. Even in a normal day, they'll travel 40 miles. They routinely dive to depths in excess of 21 feet, so that's 7 meters there. So they are deep diving animals. They can dive well over 500 feet deep. That is beyond, human capabilities without a big, heavy suit on that actually protects us from the pressure. That's what's fascinating about how deep they can dive, is they can withstand the pressures at that depth. If you've ever been snorkeling or diving or even swimming in a pool, you know that the pressure changes can make your ears pop. This is something that actually presses down on their whole bodies, and they are capable of withstanding that. So these are animals that live in a three-dimensional environment. They can go up and down as well as side to side. So this is a graphic I really particularly think is effective at sort of showing you what the problem is. So this is a track from a real whale. He was K33 in the Southern residents who live in Washington State. He was wearing a tag, and this yellow line is the track of that tag one day when he was just doing his thing. So he went down to about 525 feet, 160 meters. He did something down there. He moved around. He was probably chasing a fish. And then he came back up. From left to right, these 2 points of the line, is about 5 minutes. So it took him 5 minutes to go down to 160 meters, 525 feet, do something down there and come back up. He withstood all these pressure changes. He actually did something while he was down there, and he came back up. And this is just a routine dive that he does many times a day, every day. And as far as the the horizontal distance that he traveled, it was several hundred meters, several hundred feet. This little blue box in the middle, upper middle of the graph, so where the two axes meet, there's a rectangular cube in light blue with a blue circle around it. This is SeaWorld. This is all we can give them in captivity. It is impossible, really, for a tank to be built much bigger than this because it becomes cost prohibitive, it's too expensive, and it is hard to maintain, and it's hard to control the animals when they're in a bigger space. So this is the space that they give them at SeaWorld. This is one of the biggest tanks in the world. And they put up to 10 animals in this space. This is one whale in the yellow line going around just doing his thing for 5 minutes, but this is 24/7 what we give them in captivity. I hope you can see that there's a real disconnect here. And so typical tanks are 1/10,000%, 1/1,000,000th of the size of the natural home range. That's all we can do for them. And it's not enough given how dynamic they are, how much they swim, how deep they dive, and we can't give that to them in captivity. Excuse me. So this is a real tank in the United States, in Miami, where one whale, you can see her here, and you can see how big she is compared to the space we've given her. This is where she lived for 50 plus years. She just recently died. She managed to stay alive in this little space. Her tank mate didn't. She had a companion orca with her, and he died way back in 1980 because he developed some sort of brain aneurysm issue, and he slammed his head against the walls of this tank until his aneurysm blew and he died. Well, she managed to survive for another 40 plus years, and I don't know how. This is just a this is the size of one of your rooms, right? Your bedroom, maybe, comparatively speaking, as you can see how big she is. So she lived there 24/7. She never went anywhere else. And Miami was warm, the water was warm. It was just inappropriate. She's a cold water animal. So this is the best we can do for them, then maybe we shouldn't be doing it. Belugas also travel great distances, not as much as orcas do because they're a little bit slower, a little bit more what I call sedentary, but nevertheless, 10 to 20 kilometers, 18 miles a day, 20 miles a day. And they go they can cover, quite a distance in a day. And then they also are much deeper diving than orcas. It's an amazing thing how deep they can dive. They've been doing some research and they just discovered that one beluga was able to go down to 900 meters, which is about 3,000 feet, almost a mile. This beluga went down. Again, the pressures are enormous down there. They somehow can withstand that and come back to the surface and be fine. They do this, several times a day. They're going down to 600 meters, and 10 to 50 meters, 150 feet is nothing to them. And again, this is what we give them in captivity. There are 8 belugas in this picture. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, sorry, not 8. There's 7 belugas in this picture, and this tank, as you can see, there's a wall down at the bottom of the picture, and there's a wall that the trainer is standing on. That is the width. It's a tank that is only that wide, and then it's longer than the photo is, but that's still not great, is it? And there are 7 animals in it. So this is the problem. We cannot give them the space they need to be belugas. We cannot give them the space they need to be orcas. And sometimes the space is so small, not always, but you saw how big SeaWorld was. It's not that big. But the smaller tanks are so small that they almost can't turn around. And they certainly can't dive all the way down. The tank I showed you that the whale in Miami was living in was so shallow that if she was hanging vertical in the water, her tail touched the bottom. So they're certainly not diving anywhere. They're basically standing on the bottom of their tank sometimes. So the second big category of difference between free-ranging and captive animals is their social groupings. Who are their companions and what relationships do they have with them? In the wild, this is perfectly normal for both species. Belugas often gather in groups of 1,000 or more. Their more typical group size is like 20 or 30, but nevertheless, these big aggregations up in the Arctic, these are Arctic animals, very common. All right, they're gathering because there's food. They're gathering because they are socializing. They are gathering because they're mating. There are all sorts of reasons why they gather in these big groups, but this is what they do. On the other hand, orcas on the lower right corner of the slide are family animals. They live in family groups. Belugas tend to live with that their fundamental social group is a mother and her calves, but the larger grouping here that you see, that they're related. They're basically a village, and they've intermarried, if you will, and they've had kids and all of that, but they are not one big family. They are more like a village, okay, with several families in them. Orcas, on the other hand, their core group is a mother and all of her children, all of her sons, all of her daughters, and their children. That's their core group. So what you see here is a mother, and it's probably the female, the whale that's third from the bottom, the tiny calf that's right next to her, and then the mother may also be the 1/3 from the top. One of these 2 animals in the middle is the mother of this really tiny calf. But there's also a small juvenile, second from the top, and I think that's the female's offspring, third from the top. And so the 1/3 from the bottom is the mother of the tiny calf. The animals on the outside are her older children, all right? Her adult sons, her juvenile sons, her juvenile daughters, and perhaps an adult daughter with her own. So these 2 females in the middle are probably mother and daughter with each one having a calf. So that's the core family group in orcas. And this is what we give them in captivity, very limited social environment. This is a female that lived alone for a decade or more. Her name was Kiska. She also passed away recently. She was in Canada. So this isn't, in some obscure place in Russia. This is right here in North America. And, she was solitary. She lived all alone. And this is a family bonded, very social species. And she was living all alone. This is solitary confinement. She was basically criminalized and lived in solitary confinement, even though she didn't commit any crime. So, they're very intelligent animals. This is something I wasn't sure really myself if Kiska wasn't mentally disturbed by the way she was forced to live. They are very intelligent. They have lots of interesting behaviors that indicate this intelligence. And pretty much what you see her doing here, which is just floating at the surface, by the end of her life, that was pretty much all she was doing. Again, look at how many belugas are in this tank. You saw the earlier picture with 7 in a very small space. These 2 belugas are the only 2 in this tank. This is another facility. And again, you saw how up to 1,000 can gather in the Arctic. So this is something they are completely denied when they're in captivity. So the third category of the big differences between free-ranging and captive animals, I'm just checking the time, by the way, is the environmental quality and complexity of the facilities we are able to provide them. In the wild, of course, and when they're free-ranging, they're living in the ocean, which is about as complex as it gets as a habitat. And in captivity, we literally give them a swimming pool. So look at that. You've already seen some pictures of them in the wild. You can see how vast the spaces are. Belugas, for example, live in the Arctic. They live in the ice sometimes. And so, this is a situation where they are, doing just, amazing things out in the wild. Dealing with the ice, dealing with the cold, and this is what we give them. This is literally a swimming pool painted blue, just like you might see in a backyard or at a hotel or at a swim complex. It's nothing. It's completely uninteresting. It is boring. And even though boring doesn't sound that bad, think about if you were bored all the time. Boredom can lead to depression. Depression can kill. It's a little mantra of mine. It is not a minor thing that these animals spend a lot of their lives bored. This, by the way, is SeaWorld. Very, top of the line, state-of-the-art facility, and this is the best they can do. And again, another example, this was Marineland Antibes. They are closing. Again, we are having some success in our campaign, and more facilities are in fact closing, and the whales and the dolphins that they hold are having to be rehomed, or, the fact is most of them have died, and they haven't been able to breed them or catch them from the wild anymore, and so, they're closing. At least their exhibits. The Marineland is actually the entire facility, which was a big zoo, is closing. They've just don't have a customer base anymore. But in some instances, it's not the whole zoo that's closing, it's just their whale or dolphin exhibit. And this is because people are starting to realize there's a problem here. This is not sufficient for them. They are suffering. Their welfare is suffering when they are held by us in zoos and aquariums. And the fourth category is behavioral restrictions. And this is, kind of no duh. This is true for any predator that's put in a zoo or an aquarium. The fact is that they can't hunt. It's not common or appropriate really to put, a terrified bunny rabbit into a tiger cage and have the tiger kill it and eat it right in front of everybody. In some ways, that would be more humane for the tiger, but not for the bunny and not for the people who are watching. And so, they are in fact made to be sedentary scavengers. We feed them dead things. We feed them dead fish in the case of these whales and dolphins. We feed them steaks in the case of tigers. It's just not appropriate. Nature red in tooth and claw is the way it is for these animals out in the wild. It all works. It's a balanced ecosystem. And we take that entirely away from both sides of the equation. Predators and the prey do not have a relationship at all in captivity. And if you're supposed to be learning things about these animals by going to see them in captivity, their ecology and their behavior, then you're not getting that. Because we've taken away those relationships and we just kill the prey first and then feed it to them dead, which is not how they eat in the wild. So you're not learning that. Whales and dolphins are not scavengers. They don't eat dead things. There's plenty of animals that are scavengers, vultures and all of that, but not whales and dolphins. They kill their food and they eat it. They eat it fresh. That's not what they're getting from us in captivity. And so that is entirely taken away from them. And what you're learning is that they beg for food, which is not what they do in the wild, of course. So that's a good example. They are the top marine predator, orcas. Nothing hunts an orca except us. Okay, they are supreme in terms of, if you look at it as a food pyramid or food chain, they're at the top. Okay, nothing hunts an adult orca anyway. The calves are sometimes vulnerable to certain predators like sharks, but the adults usually protect them. Nothing can kill an adult orca except us. So this is them hunting in Patagonia and Alaska. Again, this wouldn't look very good in a tank, would it? You know, you'd be kind of shocked and appalled if you saw this. So you've got, and by the way, everybody, I'm not going to take your questions until the end, but if you're offering us questions as I go, don't worry, I'll get to them at the end. So the upper left photo is hunting in Patagonia. So this animal is actually in very shallow water, and I believe it is a male. He is pulling a sea lion pup off the beach. This is a very risky behavior for the whale. This whale could become stranded if it's not careful. But they are very good at judging. They learn as juveniles, and during that juvenile training period, it's dangerous for the juvenile. It's a risky hunting strategy, and they can become stranded. And if they're just kids, they might not be able to get themselves out of it. So it's a very risky thing when they're teaching their young how to do this. But once they become adults, they become very, very good at it. And this whale, this male, is taking this pup right off the beach. And then the wave comes in and pulls the whale back out. And it's, hugely risky for the sea lion pups, but it's how the orcas make their living. The one down in the lower right is hunting in Alaska. That poor little thing that's flying in the air on the right is a Dall's porpoise. They are very small. You can see how small they are compared to the orca. And unlike the sea lion pup, which is being, snatched off the beach by the teeth of this orca, this particular hunting technique in the lower right is a ramming technique. This whale that's up in the air in what we call a leap or a porpoise, actually, it's literally a verb as well, to porpoise, has just rammed this Dall's porpoise right into the air. And of course, eventually the porpoise dies and the orca eats it. This is what we give them in captivity. This is dead fish in that igloo, that little cooler that the trainer's holding. And that posture that you see in the orca, head up and mouth open, is a begging posture. They're waiting for fish to just fall into their mouth, dead fish to fall into their mouth. So there's two things wrong with this. One is, why would a free-ranging whale ever have its head up out of the water with its mouth open? They definitely have their heads out of the water all the time. That's called spy hop. And they're literally looking around for landmarks and such to navigate. This particular posture with the mouth open would never happen, though, because food doesn't fall from the sky in nature. It's a live animal that they're chasing around in the water, like you see here. So, why would they ever open their mouth when their head is out of the water in a spy hop, except in captivity, where dead fish do fall from the sky? The other problem is because they do this all the time, because this is how they eat, their eyes are exposed to sunlight far more in captivity than they are in the wild. It's not that their eyes are never exposed to daylight in the wild, but it's very rare, and they're usually swimming below the surface of the water. They only spend about 10% of their time at the surface in the wild, maybe 20% sometimes. And they're not looking directly at the sun when they're doing it. They're just swimming at the surface. Whereas in this particular situation in captivity, they're spending about up to 40 to 50% of the time in this position with their eyes exposed to sunlight. And it's a problem for them. They actually develop all sorts of eye problems in captivity because they don't need shade in the wild, because they avoid the sun's direct, nasty UV rays by diving, by being below the surface. The water itself are their sunglasses, if you will. Whereas in captivity, where they spend so much of their time soliciting food, there's no shade, and they're not at depth. They're not below the surface. And so they're literally staring at the sun, if you will. And they do develop all kinds of eye problems in captivity because of that. Cataracts, opacities, they literally go blind sometimes. And that's all because of captivity, because of this the way we feed them. Now, some of them are fish eaters, orcas. I actually studied fish. I'm an orca biologist, by the way. And I studied fish-eating orcas, not mammal-eating orcas. But even there, they're cooperative hunters, and they fish together, if you will. This is a herring ball that a group of orcas have formed by herding the fish together. And then they take turns going through it, snatching fish out of the water column. And this is, a highly sophisticated cooperative behavior. And again, this is what happens in captivity. This whale is up on the deck. That's called beaching, which again is not except in certain hunting situations where they're very, very briefly on the beach to grab a pup, a sea lion pup. This beaching behavior where they're actually doing a photo opportunity with performers is very rare in the wild. In fact, usually when they're stranded for that length of time, they're sick or dying and they strand on a beach. This is a behavior they're asked to do over and over and over again in captivity. The photo opportunity, if you will, it's when they let the whale pose and everybody in the audience takes a picture. And again, that's not natural, and it's not, it's not teaching you anything about natural behavior or ecology. Impact of captivity on orcas and belugas. So these are the various problems they suffer. I've already told you about a couple, about the eyes, about the fact that they don't get to behave naturally. These natural behaviors are taken from them. But there are, aside from the eyes, there are a number of other problematic physical impacts that can shorten their lives. So again, ignore the fine print, but those are the references for what I'm about to tell you. Belugas don't breed very well in captivity. They are not closely related to orcas. They are different families. And so, evolutionarily. And so the way they breed is different from the way orcas breed, and they don't breed very well in captivity. It's hard to get a beluga pregnant, and it's hard to get the female beluga to carry that calf to term. And then it's hard for the female to keep it alive once it's born. And so even if you can get a beluga female pregnant, which is hard, and even if you can get her to give birth, to carry it to term and give birth, which is hard, she may not even be able to keep it alive once it's born. And so they can live very, very short lives. There's a lot of calf mortality in belugas. So again, this is not a species that handles whatever stressors it's experiencing in captivity very well, and so it doesn't breed very well. And quite frankly, when there's a poor breeding record in captivity for any wildlife, any species, terrestrial, bird, reptile, doesn't matter, it suggests welfare is compromised. There's a lot of research on this. And so the fact that belugas don't breed well, they breed, but they don't breed well, is a really good sign that there's something wrong with keeping them in captivity, and maybe you should stop doing it. Sort of the punchline of my entire presentation. I think we should stop holding these species in zoos and aquariums because we have enough data now to know they don't thrive when they're there. And for belugas, it's their breeding record. and a few other things, by the way. For orcas, one of the most fascinating things that happens to them, and it's a terrible thing, by the way, is their teeth are severely damaged when they're in captivity. So I'm sorry for the picture. This is a dead animal that's stranded on a beach, but look at those teeth. They're basically shaped like traffic cones with a bit of a curve at the top. They're not terribly pointy because when they feed, they do wear what we call the apical tip, the very tippy top of their teeth. So they're not like cat teeth, which are horribly sharp, but they can be. There are some populations of orcas that feed on fish that are not terribly abrasive, and they actually have really quite pointy teeth. These whales' teeth are not super pointy, but they're pretty pointy. And they can tear, a fish apart or a marine mammal apart, and that's how they feed. They have upper and lower teeth, and they fit together, interlocking. And so when they do bite down on something like a sea lion pup, they don't let go. And so this is their normal teeth. This is the whale is dead, but their teeth are healthy. This is what happens in captivity. I hope you can see the difference. All right. This whale, which by the way is Tilikum, the whale that was featured in Blackfish. If you've seen the film, I do urge you to see the film. It's available online all over the place. Blackfish was produced over 10 years ago now. It's an extremely game-changing documentary, and millions of people have seen it. This whale, Tilikum, he ground his lower teeth. These are the teeth we're talking about over here on the left. He ground the lower teeth right down to the gum line on the sides of his tank. He literally, in boredom, in frustration, what we call stereotypies. These are repetitive behaviors that have no function. If you're a horse person, you know that horses crib on the sides of their stalls. It's the very same behavior, but because it's not wood, it's concrete, they literally grind their teeth down to the gum line. And as you can see, they're cavities. There are these openings where Tilikum has ground his teeth all the way down to the gum line. And that's exposed pulp. Just imagine how that would hurt. Their teeth are just like ours, in the sense of dentine and nerves inside. So it must hurt like crazy. And so what they do every day is they flush them out because they can't fill them. You can't fill a whale or dolphin cavity because as soon as they leave the veterinarian or the dentist, they're going to just wash it all out. It's not going to set, they're just going to wash it all out in the water. And so they literally can't fill these cavities. They just have to flush them out every day to get the food, particles, and any other gick out of it. And then they can anesthetize it a little bit with some sedatives, the stuff, just sort of topical numbing stuff so that they're not always in pain. And then if you look at the whale in the lower right, they've actually broken some of their teeth. So the top teeth look okay, and that's because you can see they're sort of recessed, so it's hard for them to grind them on anything. But the lower teeth are exposed, and they can be ground on things, but they can also be broken on metal gates. So this whale has not only ground down teeth, sort of near the front, and you can see the open cavities, but has broken several teeth. And again, just imagine breaking your teeth on a piece of metal. If that makes you cringe, it should. It makes them cringe. It's painful. And this is also an avenue for pathogens. One of the reasons bad teeth equals bad health for every mammal on the planet, from your pet cat to you. If you have bad teeth, you're going to have bad health, is because these open cavities become avenues for pathogens, bacteria, and all that, but fungus, to get into your system. All right, to actually go into your bloodstream and become a systemic problem. And I do think they're bad teeth. 70%, this paper that was written a few years ago, 70% of captive orcas have really bad teeth. Dental damage. All right. And so I actually think this is one of the reasons they don't live as long in captivity, because they have bad teeth, which leads to bad health, which shortens their lives. 70%. 30% have decent teeth, and they're the ones that are going to live longer. But for those who have bad teeth, their lives, they're not going to live very long. So dorsal fin collapse, this is the one you probably know the most about, just because every time you see a picture anywhere in the, on the internet, or anywhere you encounter a photograph of a captive orca, you're going to see this. So this again is Tilikum, and his fin has collapsed in this way over his back. Now you have to understand, it didn't just collapse. His fin grew this way. He was caught when he was only about 2 or 3 years old from the wild, from Iceland, and he grew up in captivity. And when he hit puberty, which is when the dorsal fin for a male starts to grow big, it's a secondary sexual characteristic, just like, the growth spurt in humans or growing facial hair. They literally, their hormones start flying around in their bodies, and their dorsal fin grows, and also their pectoral fins and their tails. They're very, very big compared to females. And as that dorsal fin, which is a normal baby dorsal fin originally, starts to straighten up and grow, gravity starts to pull it over. It grows that way. This is not a floppy thing. You notice it's not really touching his body. It's hanging in the air this way, because if you went up and tried to move it, it would be pretty rigid. It literally grew that way because gravity pulled it over. All right, now 100%, pretty much, I would say now 99%, because there is one male in captivity now in China who has a pretty straight dorsal fin, and it's because when he was caught in the wild, he was already 10 years old. He'd already hit puberty around, that's the youngest that a male is going to hit puberty. The average age at puberty is about 14 or 15, but he was quite young when he hit puberty. That's when he was caught. So his dorsal fin had actually started to straighten up and grow straight, and then he was caught and put in captivity, and so it just stayed that way. It hasn't actually grown much taller. His body has, but his dorsal fin's actually quite short. But it hasn't fallen over because it didn't grow that way. It grew straight when he was still in the wild before he was captured. So you understand, it doesn't become like this. It grows like this. It does happen in the wild very, very rarely. About 99% of orca males in captivity have collapsed dorsal fins, but only 1 to 5% have it in the wild. But 1 to 5% have it in the wild. Look at the difference. The base of the dorsal fin here, on the right-hand picture, is normal. This is not on the left. It's not normal. The base is actually leaning already, and then the whole dorsal fin grows that way. This one actually grew normally, and then he was shot with a bullet, experienced a disease. Something caused his dorsal fin to, in fact, collapse after it grew normally into an adult dorsal fin. And it's different in kind, not in degree, but in kind. It doesn't look the same as the left-hand collapsed dorsal fin, because it was caused by a different cause. So it literally is straight and tall up until halfway, and then it fell over. It did fall over. And if you went up and tried to touch this dorsal fin, which I don't recommend you try to touch a wild orca, it might be kind of floppy because something happened, an insult, as we call it, an injury or a disease that caused the connective and fatty tissue in the dorsal fin to lose its cohesion, to lose its integrity and fall over. This is what it's supposed to look like. This is a male orca in the wild doing what I told you earlier is called a porpoise, leaping out of the water. And look at that dorsal fin, totally straight, totally tall. Why? It grew that way. How? He was spent 90% of his time underwater, and the water column supported it as it grew when he hit puberty. In captivity, they don't spend most of their time underwater. They spend most of their time, 50 to 60% of their time, at the surface, being fed or being trained or doing the photo opportunities. They're in air, their dorsal fins, and gravity is allowed to act on it as it grows. In the wild, gravity never gets a chance to act on the tissue in the dorsal fin. So when they hit puberty, it just grows straight because the water's holding it up when they're swimming underwater. Recent research has shown that survivorship is not great in captivity for orcas, which I told you I believe is because of their bad teeth and stress, But as you can see, 80% of free-ranging orcas reach sexual maturity, but in captivity it's only 50%. They don't live long enough to reach sexual maturity more than half the time. And orcas have menopause just like human beings do, which is really a pretty interesting phenomenon. It's not common in the animal kingdom. About half of females will reach menopause. They will reach that age and then live beyond it. That's the whole point. They live beyond their reproductive years in the wild, but only 7% reach menopause in captivity. Most females die long before they're going to hit menopause. Well, most of them die before they're going to, and half of them die before they're going to hit puberty. But most of them, 90+% die before they hit menopause. So again, for orcas, the survivorship rate in captivity is comparable to the survivorship rates in very polluted environments, endangered populations. Whatever's going on in captivity is affecting their survivorship in the same way many threats in the wild affect them in endangered populations. So if a population of orcas is endangered because they're starving to death. That's what's happening in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Those orcas are starving to death. They rely on salmon, and salmon are endangered as well. And so they are starving to death, and they are doing very poorly. They're endangered, and their survivorship is poor. And in fact, obviously they're not starving to death in captivity, but whatever is killing them, their bad teeth, their stress, is just as effective at doing it as starving in the wild. So, it's not great to say, oh, our whales live as long as they do in the Pacific Northwest. Oh, great. They live as long as an endangered population does. It's not impressive. Belugas seem to have a lifespan in captivity that's about half that possible in the wild. And no captive belugas ever reach the maximum age that they could reach, which is about 6 years. And they've been held since the 50s. So they're technically could be a 60-year-old beluga in captivity, but trust me, there isn't even a 50-year-old beluga in captivity. I believe the oldest so far has been 45, and like one reached 45. They very rarely live beyond 35. Very rarely. Not, half of them live past 35 and half of them die before 35, which would be a mean life expectancy. No, most of them don't live past 35. And so that means that their lifespan, their potential lifespan, is about half in captivity. And again, it's stress, who knows? They've done, some research on captive animals, but not a lot. Do captive animals help in conservation? Not really. And most of the education you get at these facilities is actually wrong. I mean, again, they're teaching in the show, for example, you're teaching the audience that these are scavengers. That's just wrong. They don't tell you about their family bonds in the orca show because They can't maintain those family bonds in captivity. They have to separate the animals so they don't commit incest. In the wild, they don't commit incest because they know better. They're culturally taught not to mate with their mothers or their sisters. But in captivity, they will mate with their mothers and sisters, which is bad. Inbreeding is bad. So they ship them off to another facility, which means they break the mother-son bond. So, it's just we can't accommodate their very complex sociality and culture in captivity. And interestingly, some of the papers that show that they don't do very much research or education or conservation have been produced by researchers who actually support keeping these animals in captivity and do a lot of research on captive animals. But yet, when they looked at the literature, they realized they weren't publishing very much. And that was a bit of a revelation for them. And they do still capture whales and dolphins from the wild. This is they don't capture giraffes or zebras or anything from the wild anymore. They don't have to because they breed in captivity. Even when whales and dolphins do breed in captivity, they don't breed often enough to self-sustain the population in captivity. And inbreeding then becomes a problem. Belugas, that's not a risk yet because they don't breed very well. Orcas actually breed comparatively well compared to belugas. They get pregnant, they carry a calf to term, and they are able to keep it alive. So now you've got a whole bunch of brothers and sisters, half brothers and half sisters, first cousins living together. And what do you do when it comes breeding time for the adults? They're all related to each other because it's not a very big. I remember the first slide. There's only 54 orcas in captivity globally. That's a very, very tiny village, and everybody's related to everybody else. So the idea of avoiding inbreeding becomes almost impossible. You can't avoid inbreeding. So even if you can breed them, because they will breed, you got a problem. So you go to the wild and get more. Interestingly, this is a fairly complicated slide, so you don't have to read every word, but look at the red highlighted bits. They did a lot of captures in Russia for a while of orcas, very recently. Look at the dates, 2003, 2012, 2013. This is within the last couple decades. They were capturing quite a few orcas in Russia. That's the gist of this slide. Most of them were going to China. Some of them were staying in Russia. Nobody else wanted to buy them. Those Russian orcas didn't go anywhere else, just to China and domestically to Russia. Only one of the orcas in Russia is still alive. All the others that they kept in country are dead. And again, this is only in the last 2 decades, and they live as long as we do. They can live 80 to 90 years. Mean life expectancy for females in orcas is 50. Mean life expectancy for males is 30 decades. And in 2 decades, all of the orcas that were kept in Russia are dead, and the rest are in China. And I was just there in January last year, a little bit more than a year ago. And there are, we know for sure, 22 orcas, 7 of whom were captive born in China now. There are more orcas in China than there are in the United States now, captive orcas. And there are 2 others we think might be in China, but we can't confirm that. Again, China and Russia, real hard to find information about these animals. They don't keep records publicly. And so I don't know whether, the 15 that were wild caught that are still apparently alive in China are actually the original ones that were caught back in 20, as you can see there, 2013 and so on. I'm not sure they're still the same ones, and there weren't some more that came in and weren't recorded in the records, the trade records. I don't know. But there are 15 wild caught orcas that you can see in China and 7 captive born. And I saw 14 of them. No, more than that. I saw 18 of them. The 4 I didn't see are somewhere off-site. They are being held not in a public display facility, in some sort of holding facility somewhere. But they claim they're still there and they claim they're still alive, but I can't confirm that. But I did see 18 of them, and they're performing and they're breeding. And yeah, it's an interesting situation in China. We are working on campaigning there. Again, I'm just checking the time. All right, I'm going to stop soon because I want to take some questions. So Russian captures are now prohibited, so that source is no longer available to them. That box on the deck of the here with the blue tarp, that actually has an animal, beluga, inside of it. There were 100, and as you could do the math there were 101 orcas and belugas, these little white figures in this aerial photograph are belugas, and then in this covered area, so this covered area, in the upper right photo and the lower left photo, the covered area, there were orcas. So 11 orcas. They were all released, except for 4 that died. And that's pretty impressive. We campaigned to keep those animals out of trade. They were all going to China or staying in Russia, and they were all released. And I believe most of them survived that release. It was a traumatic experience for them. They were in there, these silly little pens for almost over a year, but they were released, and I think most of them survived. But we kept them out of trade, and that was the main thing. I'm going to skip this because it's a little complicated and I don't have the time. These are sources that you can go to, popular sources. They're books on the left and the right. Death at SeaWorld and Beneath the Surface are 2 popular books, nonfiction. Blackfish, you've heard of, no doubt. It's the documentary I mentioned earlier. Born to be Free is also a documentary about the beluga trade out of Russia. Again, both the orca and the beluga trade have stopped out of Russia. They no longer capture them. You know, there was this big release of all of these animals, and they no longer capture them. They could start up again, don't get me wrong, but at the moment they are not capturing them, and there is no trade out of Russia with these animals, and there's no domestic retention because they're not actually capturing them from the wild anymore. So that's a big deal. And then the one in the lower right there, Long Gone Wild, is a documentary that basically takes up where Blackfish leaves off and updates the situation. It was made after Blackfish and discusses some of the same issues, but post Blackfish, which is a very different landscape than pre Blackfish. I did a TEDx talk, that's me in the green down at the bottom, on the situation with orcas in captivity. If you're ever interested, that's the URL at the very top. You can take a picture of that. I'll leave it up for a second here, and go listen to me talk about orcas, just orcas, not belugas, and why it's a bad idea to keep them in captivity. Some of the things I've talked about today, but a little bit more accessible, you know, because it was a popular TEDx talk, not a more technical presentation as I've given you today. We do work in China, as I mentioned. Those are 2 reports that we've done in 2015 on the left, 2019 on the right, and then we've just done one in 2024. That's the latest update report of the situation in China, which is really disturbing and concerning, but we are making some progress. Slow, but when change comes to China, it will come very quickly because the government has the authority, has the ability to change things very quickly. That's me there in the middle, giving a presentation to the public, just like I'm giving to you, in Chinese. Well, I don't speak Chinese, I'm speaking English, but it's all translated sequentially into Chinese, and all my slides are in Chinese. And I do this I've been to China 5 times now doing this sort of thing. I'm co-author on this paper, Harmful Effects of Captivity and Chronic Stress on the Well-Being of Orcas. So I do try to publish in the peer-reviewed literature when I can. This is a white paper that my organization has prepared, and you are more than happy, more than welcome to download it from our website. So just go to awionline.org and put in the case against marine mammals in captivity, and you'll find this document online. And there's all of my social media and my email address. Please feel free to email me with any of the questions we don't get to today. So I'm going to stop. Well, no, I'm not going to stop sharing my screen because I want you to see my, I'm going to go back to that. But I'm trying to, Brittany, sorry, not Brittany, Emily or Isabella, can you get me the first question? I know there's about 10 of them. I just don't know how to pull down that screen.
Hi, so the first question says, I live in Chicago and love to attend the Shedd Aquarium, but I've noticed that they found around 5 beluga whales in one tank. It felt odd and inhumane to me. Is there any way the public can help these belugas? Should we attempt to convince the aquarium to release the wild animals or at least give them a larger tank?
So Shedd Aquarium is a fairly well-known facility in Chicago, and yes, they do have belugas there. And we are working on that. I will tell you that it's highly likely that they won't have belugas for much longer. The United States only has about 30, and you notice they have around 4 or 5 there alone, and they're not breeding very well. So they are very desperate either to get wild-caught animals, which they tried once and failed, because it didn't meet the standards of our Marine Mammal Protection Act, or they're just simply going to have to keep these animals, alive until they die, and then they won't be replaced. So we're already in the process of losing captive belugas as an exhibit, through attrition. As to what can be done for these animals, yeah, write to the Shedd Aquarium and tell them you don't like it. Tell them you would love these animals to go to sanctuary. Tell them they should build their own sanctuary. A larger facility on the coast, say off of the coast of Maine or something, where they can be retired and where they can live in a more natural habitat, still cared for by humans because they can't survive in the wild, but not in a tank, a tiny tank in Chicago. So try that. And by the way, I'm back, so I can get the questions myself. The second question is about the importance of orca migration patterns and maintaining marine biodiversity and how it changes in migratory behavior linked to environmental factors. Well, orca migration is actually not as extensive as you think. They tend to be, there's 2 types. There's residents and transients, if you will. Residents tend to have a home range and they stay in it. They don't migrate per se. They might use different parts of their home range in certain seasons and move to another part of their home range in another season, but they don't literally migrate north, south, east, west, or anything like that. They are staying within a defined home range. Others are really, really what we call transient. They just cover huge amounts of ground following food. And for transients, most of the time, the food is other marine mammals. And so they are following their marine mammal prey, and some of them aren't necessarily migrating, or if they are, then that's the pattern the transients show. So, or the mammal eaters, I should call them. So basically, you are, you're not getting like a lot of distribution of resources or anything like that through orcas. Orcas are maintaining prey populations at a certain level. They are apex predators. They are potentially keystone species, i.e., if you remove them, then there'll be a lot of negative effects. So, there are very few endangered populations. The species as a whole is not endangered. And so we don't even know how many there are globally, but there's probably not many more than 100,000 orcas globally. And that's the way that's the way it's supposed to be. They're not meant to be that numerous because they're so effective at what they do in terms of being predators. And so if there were more of them, there wouldn't be any prey. So, this is a situation where their contribution to the ecology is, going to be more local, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They're not really affecting their ecosystems through migration, which is, for example, not the case with baleen whales, the great whales like humpback whales and whatever. They migrate great distances and they are shifting things around by moving those distances. They're shifting resources around. They are affecting their ecosystems over great distances at different times of the year, whereas orcas are affecting their ecosystems more locally. I mentioned family groups being primarily led by the mother. Where are the male adults or the fathers? Okay, so that's really if you yeah, no. I don't know if you heard me say this, but sons and daughters live with their mothers their whole life. So the adult males are with their mothers. Those in the photo I showed you of the family group spread out, the one on the very top of the photograph was a big male, and he was the son of one of the females in the middle. So they are living with their mom for their whole lives. They don't mate with her, and they don't mate with their sisters, and they don't mate with their first cousins. Not when they're a healthy population, anyway. They might start doing that when they're not so healthy. That's culturally trained into them. They're told not to mate with their, they're taught not to mate with their sisters or their mothers. And so how they mate is that, their mom pretty much introduces them to nice girls. They're very social, the females, and the males are with their mothers. And so they meet these girls that are not, these females that are not related to them, and they go off with that female and they mate with her. But after they're done, they come home. So there's no paternal care whatsoever. However, adult males, the sons of the female who has other calves, his younger brothers and sisters, he will often babysit his younger brothers and sisters while his mother goes off and socializes or relaxes because she's, been able to dump the kid on her son. So they pay for the rent that they pay for living with their mom is babysitting, right? And they don't care for their direct offspring at all because they're in some other family group. And the brothers of his offspring, are caring for his offspring. He never cares for his offspring at all. He cares for his brothers and sisters. So it's a fascinating social structure and a society that's really, really pretty amazing. So yeah, there's no bachelor groups, nothing like that. They travel with their moms. Is there any international or national legislation that that has made steps in the right direction to release the? Oh, absolutely. California passed a bill that is phasing out the captivity of orcas in California, and so SeaWorld San Diego is subject to that law, and they are no longer allowed to breed and no longer allowed to import into the state any orcas. So the now 8, I believe, or 7 even, orcas in San Diego are the last 7 orcas that are ever going to be in San Diego in California. We've got several countries now. Canada has passed a law that prohibits the public display of whales and dolphins, and they only have one facility left, and that facility is closing very soon. France has just passed a law that prohibits the public display of whales and dolphins, and they are also getting rid of their last whales and dolphins. Unfortunately, they're probably going to stay in captivity somewhere else in the European Union, but they're going to be out of France. And so we are slowly but surely passing a series of domestic laws in various countries that are closing the last whale and dolphin exhibits in those countries. And it's slow because we're not saying, release them all into the wild. They can't be. They need to be cared for the rest of their life. And so, we're talking about no breeding, no captures, and no trade. So the ones you have right now are the last ones you're ever going to have, and you're not going to breed them. So inbreeding is no longer a problem. You're going to put them on birth control, basically, and you're going to leave them where they are. Or if you're smart, you build a sanctuary and you put them in a sanctuary. And we're really pushing that, and we're working ourselves on building sanctuaries. I'm on the board of directors of a project that's in Nova Scotia, Canada, and we're trying to, get some residents for our sanctuary. But basically, there's a juggernaut of legislation being passed around the world to phase out, that's the way I put it, phase out the public display of whales and dolphins. And if we're lucky, we'll basically not see any captive whales or dolphins in another 30 or 40 years. That's the goal. How do human activities such as pollution, noise, and shipping, I've got another minute, affect the biodiversity of orca populations? Oh, terribly. Yeah, they're all whales and dolphins are under threat from all of those things, from noise pollution, chemical pollution, ship strikes, entanglement in fishing gear, #1 killer of whales and dolphins globally. Derelict fishing gear, active fishing gear, doesn't matter. It entangles whales and dolphins and they drown. And so this is a really big problem. Yeah, they're all under threat. There are some healthy populations of whales and dolphins, but they're still under threat. I mean, they're healthy because they're in an area where there's not a lot of human activity. But every day that area shrinks. So eventually they will also be under threat. So we really have to do our best to try to lighten that load, to try to alleviate and mitigate these threats. Not just for orcas, but obviously for every marine wildlife species in the ocean. And I'll get one more question in. What role do orcas play in regulating marine mammal populations, and how does their top-down influence on food chains contribute to overall marine diversity? Just the way any top predator does, right? They keep the lower food chain or food web, if you will, species in check, and therefore, the entire productivity of the ecosystem can be maximized. The herbivores don't eat too much vegetation, the predators don't eat too many herbivores, and everything stays in balance. That's the ideal. It's very rare, but that's the ideal. And orcas are top predators, and so they keep everything below them in check, which allows the primary productivity to maintain at a certain level, and everything works. I am going to urge you all to write to me. My email is naomi@awionline.org. and I will answer any of the questions that I haven't been able to get to.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day.